started, I do have a few housekeeping items to keep us a little organized. We will be utilizing the Q&A function to keep us organized. There will be a formal Q&A discussion at the end, but we encourage you to utilize the Q&A box, which is going to be at the bottom of your toolbar on Zoom here, to put in your questions as they come up, because we have lots of people working hard behind the scenes to answer them. Any unanswered questions will be addressed in a follow-up, so you can stay tuned for that just in case that happens. We will be utilizing the chat function to put any references and links, so keep your eyes out for that. Participants will not have access to type in the chat box. Just please note that all your questions need to go in the Q&A function. Please keep your mic muted, of course. As well, this will be a recorded webinar, so please just note that we will be sending this out afterwards. And yeah, now I'd like to pass it off to the Center for Sustainable Materials Management Executive Director, Catherine Walker.
Great. Thanks, Lindsay. Good morning, everybody, and welcome again to the New York Needs Assessment webinar. As Lindsay said, I'm the Executive Director for the Center, or CSMM, which is based in Syracuse at SUNY ESF, and I'm so glad you are all here today with us. For those of you who may not know CSM already, we were created in 2019 to help New York move toward a more circular materials system. We are funded through the Environmental Protection Fund and administered by the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. Our mission is to collectively challenge the concept of waste through redefining and reimagining how we procure, produce, consume, manage, and market materials. And we're so proud to be part of a large and active network in New York State that wants to build stronger reuse and recycling systems that work for communities, businesses, and the environment. We launched this needs assessment in part because we know New York has set a bold goal, which is 85% recycling by 2050. Ambition alone is not going to build that infrastructure or fund programs, and certainly does not fix broken systems. So before New York passed a sweeping policy, we dove into how recycling works and doesn't work today in New York. We're proud that New York is the only state in the country to conduct a recycling system needs assessment before passing an extended producer responsibility law for paper and packaging. And what you'll see today is the result of a year of listening, analysis, site visits, surveys, and conversations across all 9 regions of the state. And that's covering nearly the entire population. And this report, as you can imagine, exists because of extraordinary collaboration. So first, I'd like to thank the hundreds of stakeholders, recycling coordinators, facility operators, local governments, haulers, advocates, and industry leaders who opened their doors and shared their challenges and told the truth about what's working and what's not. Secondly, thank you to the New York Department of Environmental Conservation for investing in this evidence-based policy and trusting data to guide this strategy. And last but not least, RRS, our research partner, whose team brought both rigor and heart to this work, especially Risa Dominio and Sarah Guthridge, who you're going to hear from today. So phase 2 answers, as you'll see, where we are now, and phase 3 will answer the harder questions and the exciting questions of what will it take to build a system that is going to work for everybody. Finally, thanks for joining today, and I'm so thrilled to hand it over to RRS and Sarah Guthridge. Sarah?
Thank you for that, Catherine. Good morning. I am Sarah Guthridge, and I'm a consultant with Resource Recycling Systems. RRS is a mission-driven sustainability consulting firm specializing in circular economy and materials management solutions for businesses, communities, and the broader future. I'd like to thank everyone for being here this morning, especially all those who participated in our research through interviews and surveys. Whether you did a survey or helped us promote participation, you are so appreciated, and this work wouldn't be possible without your input. We hope the reports we produce will help anyone on this call better understand the state's recycling, your region's recycling, or shed lights on part of the system that you're most interested in. The New York Needs Assessment is broken into 3 project phases spanning 3 years. The first phase was the pre-needs assessment, identifying the gaps that exist in recycling data, completed in May 2024. Today, we'll be presenting information covered in the phase 2 report, which was released this past October and available for download in the chat. We will conclude the needs assessment with phase 3, researching current reuse systems, greenhouse gas and employment impacts, commodity markets, and modeling scenarios for the future of New York's recycling system. This third phase is currently active with a completion target of fall 2026, and early stage data is expected to be available by spring, the end of the second quarter of 2026. We were brought on by CSMM to do a statewide needs assessment on recycling. New York's 2023 solid waste management plan set an aggressive 85% recycling target for municipal solid waste by 2050. The needs assessment focuses on packaging and paper products, which make up 44% of the state's MSW stream. That stream includes both trash and recycling. Extended producer responsibility, or EPR, is identified as a tool to address the packaging and paper stream in both the New York State Solid Waste Management Plan and the state's Climate Action Plan. Effective EPR policy creates sustainable funding for recycling programs and infrastructure. Here's a snapshot of our research approach. We conducted 3 surveys, one for residents, one for commercial businesses and institutions, one for haulers. You can see the number of survey respondents under each one, and within the appendix, you can read more and see our methodology and each survey's questions. We reviewed online municipal communication to residents on how and what to recycle, covering 90% of the state's total population with representation in each region. We reviewed every planning unit's local solid waste management plan, looking for information related to residential, commercial, and institutional recycling services. We reviewed 162 local laws to assess how they address 10 different focus areas. We reached out to all 69 planning units in the state and conducted interviews with 49 of them in total. 88 of the state's population was represented in the planning units we interviewed. We also conducted interviews with recycling facilities. 14 were surveyed, and 8 of those had site visits. Through these site visits and interviews, we learned about their processing capacity, throughput, and capabilities. We also interviewed 22 organics facilities to learn about whether they accept and process compostable packaging and food serviceware. Overall, recycling programs covering 97% of the state's population were reviewed for this work. Recycling is a system that relies on 6 main pillars: collection, processing, end markets, education and engagement, policies, and funding. All of these need to be working together for the system to be efficient. Throughout our research, we ultimately found areas in each pillar that need to be strengthened to make our recycling system more effective. Curbside recycling is available to nearly all New Yorkers, and people receive access in different ways, through municipally provided services or through subscription services. With processing recyclables, most facilities are privately operated and may not be well integrated or coordinated with collection and education programs, which are typically driven by municipalities or provided by private haulers. In end markets, collection programs don't respond quickly to end market signals, creating a disconnect where some materials have no buyers while others face chronic undersupply. This instability limits investment and erodes public confidence in recycling. For education and engagement, more than half of the planning units we talked to spent less than $1 a household, which is 1/10 of what is currently considered best practice. For policies, we have a policy framework that was developed 40 years ago. The materials in the waste stream and how we manage them have changed a lot since then. Funding: New York State recycling programs have lacked sustainable, consistent funding. State grants have been helpful, but recycling is an ongoing cost and needs to be covered, and municipalities struggle to fund it. Let's cover what we know. Here's some big picture takeaways from the report. 97% of residents, 7.4 million people, have curbside recycling services available. Over half of these are New York City residents. 87% of multifamily households can recycle on premises at their apartment complexes. Again, about half of these are New York City residents. Upstate apartment buildings don't have consistent access to on-premises recycling. When New York City is excluded, only 48% of multifamily residents have access to recycling. With our recycling rate, we have access, but 70% of paper and packaging, highly recyclable items, are going to landfill despite this. The recycling rate for paper and packaging is estimated to be 30%. The cost of recycling. We've estimated a cost here through our research of 788 million total, including New York City, and 150 million as a standalone New York City estimate. Curbside recycling. This map shows how residents throughout the state receive curbside recycling services. By population, 80% of the state's residents receive curbside service through their municipality, either through contracted services or municipal services. However, when considering these service types geographically and not by population, you can see that the darker blue and teal shaded areas representing municipal services are focused primarily in the densely populated regions of the state, New York City and Long Island. By geography, the state's population overwhelmingly receives curbside services through subscription, which you can see in the light blue taking up lots of space on this map. This shows us that geographically, most of the state receives their curbside collection from private haulers through subscription services. Talking about materials, we see that 97% of the state's population has access to recycling, but what are they able to recycle? Through our research and conversations with planning unit staff, we determined what materials at least 60% of the state's population are able to recycle through curbside service. 60% is used for this analysis because it's the FTC's threshold for considering material recyclable. Items such as cardboard, newspaper, PET #1 plastic bottles and jars, and HDPE #2 plastic containers, glass bottles and jars, and ferrous metal containers can be recycled curbside by 60% or above the state's population. Materials that have less than 60% acceptance in curbside recycling programs are items like plastic film, paper cups, aluminum foil and trays, and other glass. The same determination was made for recyclables accepted for drop-off at transfer stations throughout the state. Drop-off at transfer stations provide basic recycling access and are the main access to recycling services for rural areas that may not have curbside services available. There is opportunity for expansion of drop-off at transfer stations to become a comprehensive place for New Yorkers to recycle basic and harder to recycle items. We just talked about how New Yorkers have access to curbside recycling and can recycle a variety of materials, but you might be thinking about the 30% packaging recycling rate we discussed at the beginning of the presentation. Access alone does not drive or deliver recycling rates. Residents who have access to that recycling service must also participate in those recycling systems and recycle the correct items. The majority of planning units are not able to track recycling participation rate, which measures how often people put out their recyclables for collection. Because of this lack of data, it is difficult to show how much of the state is participating in the recycling system. 2 planning units we spoke to were able to provide participation rates. We also know from hand sorts completed by Stony Brook's Waste Data and Analysis Center that their contamination rates vary across the state. These higher contamination rates tell us that people don't know what should be placed in the recycling containers. As you mentioned in a previous slide, access to recycling alone does not drive recycling. Another key pillar of the recycling system is education and engagement of participants. We know that people who are participating in recycling are adding incorrect items to the recycling bin. Here's a big part of the problem. Recycling education funding is not sufficient enough to engage residents. Half of the state's planning units have staff who provide education and outreach. However, these programs are wildly underfunded to support their populations. The average spend on recycling education is $1.12 per household, much less than the best practice of $10 per household. More than half of the planning units spend less than $1 per household on education efforts. It is clear that planning units are spending on the recycling system, but the spending is not allocated to resident education. Instead, most of this money is spent on transport and management of recyclable materials. How much of these costs are being transferred to the residents in New York? The biggest number on the screen is at the bottom of the slide. We've estimated the yearly cost of recycling through our research at $788 million total, including New York City, and $150 million is the New York City cost. This includes recycling collection, sorting, processing, and sale to end markets. We saw some very broad ranges of what was reported both by planning units and within survey results, so we've used averages to calculate these estimates for the statewide costs. Furthermore, the numbers reported were for bundled service, including both waste and recycling, so we had to estimate the proportion of those costs that were for recycling services. New Yorkers pay these recycling costs either directly through subscription services at $39 per month on average, or indirectly through their taxes that pay for municipal programs, which cost an average of $30 a month. Further breaking down these monthly costs, we've estimated that 40% of those costs cover recycling programs, with the remaining 60% covering waste collection and disposal. Once the recyclables are picked up, they need to go somewhere for processing. We'll talk more about those processing facilities in a minute, but for now, we will discuss the costs associated with processing. As shown in the tables, the cost of processing materials for recycling varies across the state. These costs are included in the larger costs of recycling that planning units and residents fund. So we're spending a lot of money on collection, transport, and processing. These are necessary costs, but they're still not delivering a strong system to increase recycling rates and engagement to make it successful. Residents don't often see or think about where their recyclables are going, creating a disconnect between the service and people putting the correct materials in the bin. The spending on collection, transport, and processing leaves little budget for engagement and to build trust in the system and instruct residents on what they can recycle. Commercial generators are also required to manage the recycling. With the exception of New York City, multifamily households in New York are also primarily serviced as commercial customers, getting subscription service from private haulers. The cost data on this slide was collected through our survey as well as interviews with haulers, and we were looking to isolate recycling costs alone. In the appendix, you can see the full methodology on the commercial survey. Costs range from $200 to $800 per month, depending on that size of the container and the pickup frequency. Another key part of a successful recycling system is having facilities that can process the collected material. Our report highlights the current processing infrastructure across the state. We see a big range in these facilities. Some are small, low-tech, hand-sort, and some are very large, highly automated, and at the cutting edge of technology. Recycling facilities are mostly privately owned and operated with some public-private arrangements. From speaking with recycling facility representatives, we gain information about their operations and challenges. Facilities struggle to keep wages competitive to retain long-term staff without raising their tip fees. They also want to invest in new technologies to sort more materials with viable end markets. That comes with a capital cost that can be difficult to justify. They want to engage the community to ensure they're getting the right materials on their tip floors, but they don't have the resources alone to engage meaningfully because collection may not be well integrated or coordinated with collection and education programs, which are typically driven by municipalities or provided by private haulers. As a result, most facilities indicate they could process more material, but are limited by participation levels and ability to invest in advanced sorting technologies and end market stability. The next phase of our research is ongoing now, continuing to look at MRFs and end markets to better understand what materials MRFs are sorting and selling and what markets they are selling to. Our takeaway is that we don't need to build more facilities to make recycling work. There's capacity already. We need to use these facilities better and invest in them to modernize sorting to become state of the art. Lastly, we looked at compostable packaging in organics facilities. It's unclear how it would fit into EPR since some states have addressed compostable packaging and some have not. However, it is a potential pathway for managing packaging in New York, so it was in scope for this effort. The research we did focused on 40 organics facilities that process food waste, of which we interviewed 22. Of those 22, 8 accepted and processed some compostable packaging and 14 didn't accept any compostable packaging. Our takeaway is that most of our state's organics facilities can't take compostable packaging. Most of the local recycling laws in New York were written in the late 80s or early 90s and haven't been updated. 162 local laws were reviewed to assess how municipalities regulate recycling in 10 different focus areas. Laws mandating source separation at 89% and enforcement at 94% were seen in much of the state. However, the 8 other local law criteria evaluated were not as prevalent. Our overall takeaway from phase 2 is that we have a strong base from which to build a modern world-class recycling system in New York, expansive access to recycling programs, and MRF infrastructure to sort and market materials. A stronger policy framework and additional resources are needed to drive investment to maximize public engagement and participation in recycling programs, modernize our infrastructure, and improve the effectiveness of our recycling system. On the same webpage where you can find the phase 2 report, there's also a document that includes profiles outlining research related to each state's planning unit. Each profile covers the planning unit's curbside and drop-off recycling access by household type, curbside recycling costs, program costs and funding sources, waste transporters, material recycling acceptance, local laws requiring recycling, education and outreach efforts and their costs, relationship to commercial waste generators. All of this information at each planning unit level was used to determine statewide totals. At the start of that planning unit document, there is a table of contents with clickable hyperlinks, making it really easy for you to jump to a planning unit that you're interested in looking at. This presentation offered an overview of the learnings from phase 2 of the New York Needs Assessment. I invite you to scan this QR code or use the links posted in the chat to review the entire digital report, including the appendices that offer more detail on how report data was gathered. Thank you very much for your time and interest in the findings we shared today. We're now going to transition to the Q&A portion of the webinar. And just a reminder for you to put the questions and comments only in the Q&A, please. Risa, I'll turn it to you to moderate the Q&A segment.
Great, thanks, Sarah. I appreciate that overview, and hope folks got a sense of the depth of the analysis we've done and the efforts that went into this, not just by our team, but by the full team of New Yorkers, including lots of planning units and facilities and program operators. So appreciate everyone's efforts. We've got a couple of questions in the Q&A, but would love to get more. So if folks would please drop those questions in as we get started here. We have a question here about the report saying on page 21 that in phase 3, we will define 3 scenarios that move New York to best-in-class recycling systems. Can you tell us what they are? Are they all EPR type systems, or are they building off New York State laws and programs? We also got another question about whether or not we're considering pay-as-you-throw, since that is proven to be an effective means of increasing participation. And so, Sarah, I'm going to just jump in and answer this one. Oh, I should introduce myself, I guess. I am Risa Domino. I'm the managing principal at RRS, and very pleased to lead the team that has executed this needs assessment. Longtime New Yorker, know many of you on the line, and really excited to be a part of this work. To answer those couple of questions, we have not yet defined the scenarios. That's in our next phase of work. So I can't speak exactly to what they'll be, but essentially we are focusing at this point on what are the things that need to happen for New York to be best in class. So that's what improvements do we need to make to our programs? What investments do we need to make in our systems in order to achieve the best in class kind of programs and that we will need to meet the state's very aggressive goals in the solid waste management plan. So those don't necessarily, we will look at a suite of policies that can support achieving those scenarios, but the scenarios themselves will be focused on what actually needs to happen. So I hope that helps to explain how we're looking at this. It's really about As we've seen Sarah describe, we've documented where we are and what programs we have. And in the next phase, we'll be looking at how do we get from here to where we need to be. And most of that will be focused on what programs and infrastructure do we need. And then we'll also look at what policies can support the move in that direction. So before I go further, I want to introduce my colleagues, Maria Bianchetti and Kate McGuire, who are key parts of the RRS team. And I will be addressing some of the Q&A as they come through here to those folks. So the next question is about multifamily access. And so the question is the lack of multifamily access outside of New York City a function of data accessibility, or have municipal programs indicated they do not collect from multifamily? I think I am going to direct that question to Kate McGuire. Kate, can you jump in?
Sure, happy to, Risa. Hi, everyone. I'm Kate McGuire. I was just typing out an answer. It could be a function of both. Many municipalities do not address multifamily recycling at all. Most curbside programs are directed at single family, and that's going to include up to maybe like typically 3 units or 4 units, but beyond that, 5 and above. Typically isn't addressed. Of course, multifamily residents could utilize drop-off programs, but as far as on-site, on-premise access, that's usually entirely up to the private sector. So it's going to come down to whether or not there is a private sector hauling company that can provide that service in that municipality to multifamily residents. And then further, whether the property owner or management company signs up for that type of program. So it's very difficult to track outside of, a full survey of multifamily buildings. So it's essentially both. It's a function of it not being addressed by municipalities, and in many cases, truly simply just not having that access on site.
Thanks, Kate. The next question is asking about whether data was collected about how much of the money spent, I assume this is by municipalities, went to enforcement. I'm going to ask Maria if we have a sense of that.
Good question. We did not have that question as one of our study references, something we were asking planning units. Most of our questions about costs focused on processing and collection, as well as education. I know some planning units kind of see, it's possible that education, is the first step prior to enforcement. So a lot of money is put into that bucket, but I believe there's one planning unit that did give us an enforcement budget, and I can put that in the chat when I pull it up.
Thanks so much, Maria. We got also a question, and we've gotten this question a couple times about the estimated $10 per household for education. That recommendation comes from the Recycling Partnership, and I'm going to share a report of theirs in the chat that provides that recommendation. So folks have that. Let's see. There are some questions here about things that are outside of the scope of the study. A question about kitchen scrap buckets, which would be related to food scrap collection. That is outside of the scope of the study. And another question about reuse potential for things that are not packaging, again, outside of the scope of the study. So just to let folks know that we're not going to be addressing those, as those were not the scope of this analysis. There's another question here about 2 communities measuring participation rates. Which and how did they do it? Maria, are you ready to speak to that question?
Sure, I am happy to. So they are referenced in the executive summary, but they are entities in Region 9. The city of Jamestown uh, actually has RFID tags on their recycling bins. So, which is kind of, if you ever have gone skiing, it's the type of pass where you don't have to, you just walk through a passageway and it knows that you're going through. It's a tool that allows to track like data, participation, things like that. So basically their trucks have the RFID readers and then their containers have RFID tags on them. And so every time a bin gets picked up and dumped, it signals to the truck, this street on this house had their recycling picked up this day. And so that's how they're able to get participation rates. And then the other city was the city of North Tonawanda, which is also in Region 9, and they actually did a set out study. So they've done like continuous studies and I think, sorry, I know Dawn, I don't want to misspeak, but I think it's like three or four different routes, and they check set out rates on these certain routes continuously to get that data.
All right, thanks, Maria. So we have another question here about the report, essentially the overriding recommendations here, or the overriding findings here, that we have a high level of access to collection and sufficient material processing capacity. So is it really education and engagement that's the missing link? And then what's the assessment of the potential impact of increasing education and engagement? So that's going to be a core part of phase 3, is looking at, again, how do we get from current state to future state? Yes, it was very encouraging to find out that most New Yorkers have access to recycling, but we know from the recycling rate that many are either not using it or not using it to its full potential. So how do we make sure that happens? Will be a part of what we look at in phase 3. So more to come there. We have another question here. When looking at end markets for packaging, will the next part of the study look at what products the packaging is recycled into? And the answer is to some degree, yes. We are now in the commodity markets element of this, looking more closely at what commodities our recycling facilities are producing, and to the extent they're willing to share with us, what markets they sell into, we'll be able to document that information. And so we'll be looking towards that, documenting that. But again, these facilities don't always want to tell us precisely who they're selling to, so we will make some assessments based on the commodities they're producing and the markets that we're able to learn about. Kate McGuire, is there anything you want to add on that question?
No, I don't think so, other than I think it's a great question, and part of the process of building trust with the public in this system, that they truly understand the full loop of the recycling process, that this material is being recycled so it can be made into new products. So it'll definitely be touched on in phase 3, because it is critical part that we want to communicate to New Yorkers broadly.
Thanks, Kate. I also want to address a question that came in advance with the registrations, which was, I think, related to this, and raised the question of, boy, it looks like a lot of plastic packaging is on the accepted list here. Is that really accurate? Is that stuff really being recycled? And I think what we presented in this phase of the study is what communities are directing and what waste haulers and recyclers are directing residents to put in the bin. And so that's an accurate reflection of the material that people are being asked to put in their bin. In the next phase, we'll be looking at what happens to those in the recycling facilities, what commodity they get recycled into. And so we'll have a little bit more information available in the next phase about what's happening with those materials and where are they going. Another question here, can you please reiterate the percentage of paper and packaging materials present in the recycling stream? Kate McGuire, can I ask you to answer that question?
Yeah, so the question is specifically in the recycling stream.
Recycling stream, yes.
It's a really high percentage. I want to say like 70%, but I have to pull up a spreadsheet to look at the exact percentage.
All right, we'll come back to that. Thank you, Kate. And so we got another question about the review of the recycling laws. Yes, it was impressive that our team read all 162 recycling laws and evaluated all of them. And yes, we found that most of them include enforcement. And the question is, did we dive deeper in to determine whether that enforcement was actually happening? And I don't think we did, as Maria said, in any significant way. There were, it did come up in some interviews, but not fully. So we don't know how much enforcement is actually happening.
Risa, could I just add one thing
Yeah.
about that? I would say a lot of our conversations, so part of our planning unit interviews that we did with a lot of the recycling coordinators across the state, we did talk about local laws and how they play a role, in their day-to-day work. And a few of them did mention that they are actively working on updating their laws to be more relevant for how current operations are going, and going through those processes as well. So that was something to look for as well.
Thanks, Maria. And Kate just shared with me that it's 93% of what's generally accepted in the recycling stream is paper and packaging. That's typically in the curbside recycling bin. So the vast majority of the recycling stream is paper and packaging.
Yeah, thanks, Risa. And that just to be clear, that's what's, processable at a MRF. That's not counting recyclables like electronics or textiles or things like that would be outside of your typical curbside system.
Thanks, Kate. All right, we have a question about the state budget allocation for capital for municipal waste reduction and recycling projects, and asking if we'll be getting into how those funds have been used over the past several years. We will not. That is outside of the scope of this study. I think you're free to reach out to DEC and ask for information on that. Let's see. We have a question about the participation rate calculation methodology. If someone is participating in recycling, but if they don't need to set out the recycling cart very often, would that appear to lower the recycling participation rate? Maria, can you answer that question? I mean, again, there's only 2 communities in the state that are measuring participation rates. Are they measuring individual weekly set out rates? Do we know?
Yes. Yep. They were measuring weekly set out rates. So I guess to your point, Lisa, if a person doesn't need to use their recycling that week because they've done a good job reducing their waste, yes, then it would play into the participation rate percentage. But I will also say another fact about the participation rates, we asked all of the planning units we interviewed about participation data and if they were able to track it. And as you can see, just because it is a huge undertaking. These were the two that continually do it. And so I think participation rate is one piece of performance data to like analyze a system as a whole. So it shouldn't just be considered as a standalone. I don't know if you have anything else to say, Risa.
No, I think that that makes sense. Yeah. Oh, there is a note from Dawn here in the Q&A that you want to look at, Maria, and see
Yes,
if you
I'm
want to
sorry.
address that.
Thank you. Dawn Tim is the planning unit coordinator in Niagara County where North Tonawanda is. She said in North Tonawanda, yes, it is total on the route compared to those that set out on an annual basis. Thank you, Dawn, for adding that.
All right. We have a question on will we be analyzing how much and which types of packaging is unrecyclable in New York State? The answer to that is yes. And we've started to do that in this phase, and we'll expand that into the next phase. So we have a number of material categories that have been evaluated, and we shared some information on what recycling access rates we have for those materials. And we found that about 75% of the packaging and paper products are routinely collected. So the other 25% has been identified. As we go into the next phase, we'll be looking at all of the material categories which have sufficient conditions to be considered broadly recyclable across New York State, and which need some adjustments, investments, hurdles cleared in order to be recycled in New York State, and then which will not be able to achieve recyclability in New York State. So that'll be a part of the phase 3 analysis. So we have a question here specifically about Region 5. And on the map, it notes that much of Region 5 has no curbside service. But this person lives there and says that there are 2 companies that offer service. Maria, you're responding to that one?
Yeah, I was going to respond via text, but I can also just speak to this. So that map was created through several, different ways that we gather data from online, what we call access searching, seeing how residents can get service, curbside service, and then also speaking with planning units and tracking subscription access, which it sounds like what this region primarily experiences, provided by private sector companies is challenging because most private haulers do not like to share like detailed business information, including what regions even that they collect material in. So we'd just like to thank you for sharing that information, and we will add it to our list of access. Thank you.
Let's see. We have a few questions about the law that has local law that has a recycling target diversion goal. I'm going to ask someone from the team to answer those via the chat. We have a question about the $788 million cost of recyclables collection and processing. Does that include both residential and commercial, or just residential? That is just residential. And it is the cost of recycling collection and processing. Question on when phase 3 is expected to be completed. Sarah, would you like to respond to that?
We're expecting it to be completed by the fall of 2026, but some preliminary information will be available by the end of Q2. Here's this timeline again. So we've got 4 segments of phase 3 that we're working through. These 2 are active now, and here's our target completion dates. but the full overall phase 3 is expected to be completed in the fall.
Okay, great. We have a few things being answered in the chat. So we have a question about what metrics and standards we'll be using to consider whether material is recyclable. I'm gonna start this and ask Kate McGuire to chime in too. We are looking at whether it is routinely collected in the state, which is what we've done already. What do the municipal programs tell people to do? Is it sortable in recycling facilities, and are there sufficient end markets? Kate McGuire, did I miss anything important there in the recyclability evaluation?
I don't think so. I think that was great. Thanks, Risa.
All right. There's a couple questions in here for DEC, which I think we're going to direct to them. In subscription and contracted programs, who is responsible for enforcement? That's a really good question. I think typically enforcement would happen under the local law, so it would be the local government's requirement to do that. Maria, do you have a perspective to share on that?
I would say I would agree with that, and then also add enforcement can look like many different things, but one thing that private and subscription haulers or like service providers can do for enforcement is through the process of fining or just not picking up material. I know that's a common practice. If there's enough contamination in a bin, I know I had this problem at my former apartment complex that was managed privately. If there was enough contamination in a bin, they would just not pick up the material and then force management. But I don't know, I don't have any official takeaways from our study. Just more personal antidote.
Thanks, Maria. So I think we've wrapped up the questions that we can answer at this point. We've got a couple of other answers going in the chat. I think we'll encourage everybody to go to this link and download the full report. And we are definitely open to additional questions and really excited for all of the interest in this research, which again, we are so pleased to have been able to do to move New York State forward. With that, I will hand it back to Catherine Walker.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Risa and team. Again, thank you so much to RRS and all of our partners for being part of this process. And if you have additional questions that come up after, of course, feel free to email any of us, all three of us, feel free. And like Lindsay said in the beginning, this will be recorded. So we will share this out so you can watch again if you need to, or share it with colleagues. So enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you everybody for joining, and we'll be back soon for phase 3.